The Kyoto Protocol is an international treaty which extends the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that commits state parties to reduce greenhouse gases emissions, based on the premise that global warming exists and man-made CO2 emissions have caused it. The Kyoto Protocol was adopted in Kyoto, Japan, on the 11th of December 1997 and entered into force on the 16th of February 2005. There are currently 192 parties to the protocol. The Kyoto Protocol implemented the objective of the UNFCCC to fight global warming by reducing greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere to a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. The protocol is based on the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. It puts the obligation to reduce current emissions on developed countries on the basis that they are historically responsible for the current levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The protocol's first commitment period started in 2008 and ended in 2012. A second commitment period was agreed on in 2012, known as the Doha Amendment to the Protocol, in which 37 countries have binding targets: Australia, the European Union, Belarus, Iceland, Kazakhstan, Liechtenstein, Norway, Switzerland, and Ukraine. Belarus, Kazakhstan and Ukraine have stated that they may withdraw from the protocol and not put into legal force the amendment with second-round targets. Japan, New Zealand and Russia have participated in Kyoto's first round but have not taken on new targets in the second commitment period. Other developed countries without second-round targets are Canada and the United States. As of July 2016, 66 states have accepted the Doha Amendment, while entry into force requires the acceptances of 144 states. Of the 37 countries with binding commitments, 7 have ratified. Negotiations were held in the framework of the yearly UNFCCC climate change conferences on measures to be taken after the second commitment period ends in 2020. This resulted in the 2015 adoption of the Paris Agreement, which is a separate instrument under the UNFCCC rather than an amendment of the Kyoto Protocol. Background: the view that human activities are likely responsible for most of the observed increase in global mean temperature since the mid-20th century is an accurate reflection of current scientific thinking. Human-induced warming of the climate is expected to continue throughout the 21st century and beyond. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have produced a range of projections of what the future increase in global mean temperature might be. The IPCC's projections are baseline projections, meaning that they assume no future efforts are made to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The IPCC projections cover the time period from the beginning of the 21st century to the end of the 21st century. The likely range is a projected increase in global mean temperature over the 21st century of between 1.1 and 6.4 degrees Celsius. The range in temperature projections partly reflects different projections of future greenhouse gas emissions. Different projections contain different assumptions of future social and economic development, which in turn affects projections of future greenhouse gas emissions. The range also reflects uncertainty in the response of the climate system to past and future GHG emissions. Chronology: 1992 to the UN Conference on the Environment and Development is held in Rio de Janeiro. It results in the Framework Convention on Climate Change among other agreements. 1995 Parties to the UNFCCC meet in Berlin to the UNFCCC to outline specific targets on emissions. 1997 In December the parties conclude the Kyoto Protocol in Kyoto, Japan, in which they agreed to the broad outlines of emissions targets. 2002 Russia and Canada ratified ratify the Kyoto Protocol to the UNFCCC, bringing the treaty into effect on 16 February 2005. 2011 Canada became the first signatory to announce its withdrawal from the Kyoto Protocol. 2012 On 31 December 2012, the first commitment period under the protocol expired. Article 2 of the UNFCCC. Most countries are parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Article 2 of the Convention states its ultimate objective, which is to stabilize the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. The natural, technical, and social sciences can provide information on decisions relating to this objective, e.g., the possible magnitude and rate of future climate changes. However, the IPCC has also concluded that the decision of what constitutes dangerous interference requires value judgments, which will vary between different regions of the world. Factors that might affect this decision include the local consequences of climate change impacts, the ability of a particular region to adapt to climate change, and the ability of a region to reduce its GHG emissions. Objectives. The main goal of the Kyoto Protocol is to control emissions of the main anthropogenic greenhouse gases in ways that reflect underlying national differences in GHG emissions, wealth, and capacity to make the reductions. The treaty follows the main principles agreed in the original 1992 UN Framework Convention. According to the treaty, in 2012, Annex I parties who have ratified the treaty must have fulfilled their obligations of greenhouse gas emissions limitations established for the Kyoto Protocol's first commitment period. These emissions limitation commitments are listed in Annex B of the Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol's first-round commitments are the first detailed step taken within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The Protocol establishes a structure of rolling emission reduction commitment periods. It set a timetable starting in 2006 for negotiations to establish emission reduction commitments for a second commitment period. The first period emission reduction commitments expired on 31 December 2012. The ultimate objective of the UNFCCC is the stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would stop dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Even if Annex I parties succeed in meeting the first-round commitments, much greater emission reductions will be required in future to stabilize atmospheric GHG concentrations. For each of the different anthropogenic GHGs, different levels of emissions reductions would be required to meet the objective of stabilizing atmospheric concentrations. Carbon dioxide, CO2, is the most important anthropogenic GHG. Stabilizing the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere would ultimately require the effective elimination of anthropogenic CO2 emissions. Some of the principal concepts of the Kyoto Protocol are binding commitments for the Annex I parties. The main feature of the protocol is that it established legally binding commitments to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases for Annex I parties. The commitments were based on the Berlin Mandate, which was a part of UNFCCC negotiations leading up to the protocol. Implementation. In order to meet the objectives of the protocol, Annex I parties are required to prepare policies and measures for the reduction of greenhouse gases in the respective countries. In addition, they are required to increase the absorption of these gases and utilize all mechanisms available, such as joint implementation, the Clean Development Mechanism and emissions trading, in order to be rewarded with credits that would allow more greenhouse gas emissions at home, minimizing impacts on developing countries by establishing an adaptation fund for climate change, accounting, reporting and review in order to ensure the integrity of the protocol. Compliance. Establishing a compliance committee to enforce compliance with the commitments under the protocol. First commitment period, 2008 to 12. Under the Kyoto Protocol, 37 industrialized countries and the European Community commit themselves to binding targets for GHG emissions. The targets apply to the four greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, CO2, methane, CH4, nitrous oxide, N2O, sulfur hexafluoride, SF6, and two groups of gases, hydrofluorocarbons and perfluorocarbons. The 6 GHG are translated into CO2 equivalents in determining reductions in emissions. These reduction targets are in addition to the industrial gases chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, which are dealt with under the 1987 Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer. Under the protocol, only the Annex I parties have committed themselves to national joint reduction targets. Article 4.1. Parties to the Kyoto Protocol not listed in Annex I of the Convention are mostly low-income developing countries, and may participate in the Kyoto Protocol through the Clean Development Mechanism. The emissions limitations of Annex I parties varies between different parties. Some parties have emissions limitations reduced below the base year level. Some have limitations at the base year level, while others have limitations above the base year level. Emission limits do not include emissions by international aviation and shipping. Although Belarus and Turkey are listed in the Convention's Annex I, they do not have emissions targets as they were not Annex I parties when the protocol was adopted. Kazakhstan does not have a target, but has declared that it wishes to become an Annex I party to the Convention. For most parties, 1990 is the base year for the national GHG inventory and the calculation of the assigned amount. However, 5 parties have an alternative base year. Bulgaria, 1988. Hungary, the average of the years 1985 to 87. Poland, 1988. Romania, 1989. Slovenia, 1986. Annex I parties can use a range of sophisticated flexibility mechanisms to meet the targets. Annex I parties can achieve the targets by allocating reduced annual allowances to major operators within the borders, or by allowing these operators to exceed their allocations by offsetting any excess through a mechanism that is agreed by all the parties to the UNFCCC, such as by buying emission allowances from other operators which have excess emissions credits. Flexibility mechanisms. The protocol defines 3 flexibility mechanisms that can be used by Annex I parties in meeting their emission limitation commitments. The flexibility mechanisms are international emissions trading, the Clean Development Mechanism, and joint implementation. it allows Annex I parties to trade their emissions. The economic basis for providing this flexibility is that the marginal cost of reducing emissions differs among countries. Marginal cost is the cost of abating the last ton of CO2 EQ for an Annex I, non-Annex I party. At the time of the original Kyoto targets, studies suggested that the flexibility mechanisms could reduce the overall cost of meeting the targets. Studies also showed that national losses in Annex I gross domestic product could be reduced by use of the flexibility traceability mechanisms. The CDM and G are called project-based mechanisms, in that they generate emission reductions from projects. The difference between it and the project-based mechanisms is that it is based on the setting of a quantitative restriction of emissions, while the CDM and G are based on the idea of production of emission reductions. The CDM is designed to encourage production of emission reductions in non-Annex I parties, while G encourages production of emission reductions in Annex I parties. The production of emission reductions generated by the CDM and G can be used by Annex I parties in meeting their emission limitation commitments. The emission reductions produced by the CDM and G are both measured against a hypothetical baseline of emissions that would have occurred in the absence of a particular emission reduction project. The emission reductions produced by the CDM are called certified emission reductions. Reductions produced by G are called emission reduction units. The reductions are called credits because they are emission reductions credited against a hypothetical baseline of emissions. Each Annex I country is required to submit an annual report of inventories of all anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions from sources and removals from sinks under UNFCCC in the Kyoto Protocol. These countries nominate a person to create and manage its greenhouse gas inventory. Virtually all of the non-Annex I countries have also established a designated national authority to manage the Kyoto obligations, specifically the CDM process. This determines which GHG projects they wish to propose for accreditation by the CDM Executive Board. International emissions trading. A number of emissions trading schemes have been, or are planned to be, implemented. Asia. Japan. Emissions trading in Tokyo started in 2010. This scheme is run by the Tokyo Metropolitan Government. European Union. The European Union Emission Trading Scheme, which started in 2005. This is run by the European Commission. Norway. Domestic emissions trading in Norway started in 2005. This was run by the Norwegian government, which is now a participant in the EU ETS. Switzerland. The Swiss ETS, which runs from 2008 to 2012 to coincide with the Kyoto Protocol's first commitment period. United Kingdom. The UK Emissions Trading Scheme, which ran from 2002 to 06. This was a scheme run by the UK government, which is now a participant in the EU ETS. The UK CRC Energy Efficiency Scheme, which started in 2010, and is run by the UK government. North America. Canada. Emissions trading in Alberta, Canada, which started in 2007. This is run by the government of Alberta. United States. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which started in 2009. This scheme caps emissions from power generation in 10 northeastern U.S. states. Emissions trading in California, which started in 2013. The Western Climate Initiative, which is planned to start in 2012. This is a collective ETS agreed between 11 U.S. states and Canadian provinces. Oceania. Australia. The New South Wales Greenhouse Gas Reduction Scheme, which started in 2003. This scheme is run by the Australian state of New South Wales, and has now joined the Alpha Climate Stabilization. New Zealand. The New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme, which started in 2008. Intergovernmental emissions trading. The design of the European Union Emissions Trading Scheme implicitly allows for trade of national Kyoto obligations to occur between participating countries. Carbon Trust found that other than the trading that occurs as part of the EU ETS, no intergovernmental emissions trading had taken place. one of the environmental problems with it is the large surplus of allowances that are available. Russia, Ukraine, and the new EU 12 member states have a surplus of allowances, while many OECD countries have a deficit. Some of the EITs with a surplus regard it as potential compensation for the trauma of their economic restructuring. When the Kyoto Treaty was negotiated, it was recognized that emissions targets for the EITs might lead to them having an excess number of allowances. This excess of allowances were viewed by the EITs as headroom to grow their economies. The surplus has, however, also been referred to by some as hot air, a term which Russia views as quite offensive. OECD countries with a deficit could meet their Kyoto commitments by buying allowances from transition countries with a surplus. Unless other commitments were made to reduce the total surplus in allowances, such trade would not actually result in emissions being reduced. Green Investment Scheme. A green investment scheme refers to a plan for achieving environmental benefits from trading surplus allowances under the Kyoto Protocol. The Green Investment Scheme, a mechanism in the framework of international emissions trading, is designed to achieve greater flexibility in reaching the targets of the Kyoto Protocol while preserving environmental integrity of it. However, using the GIS is not required under the Kyoto Protocol, and there is no official definition of the term. Under the GIS, a party to the protocol expecting that the development of its economy will not exhaust its Kyoto quota, can sell the excess of its Kyoto quota units to another party. The proceeds from the AAU sales should be greened, i.e., channeled to the development and implementation of the projects either acquiring the greenhouse gases emission reductions or building up the necessary framework for this process. Trade in AAUs. Latvia was one of the front-runners of GISs. World Bank reported that Latvia has stopped offering AAU sales because of low AAU prices. In 2010, Estonia was the preferred source for AAU buyers, followed by the Czech Republic and Poland. Japan's national policy to meet their Kyoto target includes the purchase of AAUs sold under GISs. In 2010, Japan and Japanese firms were the main buyers of AAUs. In terms of the international carbon market, trade in AAUs are a small proportion of overall market value. In 2010, 97% of trade in the international carbon market was driven by the European Union Emission Trading Scheme. However, firms regulated under the EU ETS are unable to use AAUs in meeting their emissions caps. Clean Development Mechanism. Between 2001, which was the first year Clean Development Mechanism projects could be registered, and 2012, the end of the first Kyoto commitment period, the CDM is expected to produce some 1.5 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in emission reductions. Most of these reductions are through renewable energy commercialization, energy efficiency, and fuel switching. By 2012, the largest potential for production of CERs are estimated in China and India. CERs produced in Latin America and the Caribbean make up 15% of the potential total, with Brazil as the largest producer in the region. Joint implementation. The formal crediting period for joint implementation was aligned with the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, and did not start until January 2008. In November 2008, only 22 projects had been officially approved and registered. The total projected emission savings from G by 2012 are about 1/10 that of the CDM. Russia accounts for about 2/3 of these savings, with the remainder divided up roughly equally between the Ukraine and the EU's new member states. Emission savings include cuts in methane, HFC, and N2O emissions. Stabilization of Ghg concentrations. As noted earlier on, the first-round Kyoto emissions limitation commitments are not sufficient to stabilize the atmospheric concentration of GHGs. Stabilization of atmospheric GHG concentrations will require further emissions reductions after the end of the first-round Kyoto commitment period. In 2012, background analysts have developed scenarios of future changes in GHG emissions that lead to a stabilization in the atmospheric concentrations of GHGs. Climate models suggest that lower stabilization levels are associated with lower magnitudes of future global warming, while higher stabilization levels are associated with higher magnitudes of future global warming. To achieve stabilization, global GHG emissions must peak, then decline. The lower the desired stabilization level, the sooner this peak and decline must occur. For a given stabilization level, larger emissions reductions in the near term allow for less stringent emissions reductions later on. On the other hand, less stringent near-term emissions reductions would, for a given stabilization level, require more stringent emissions reductions later on. The first-period Kyoto emissions limitations can be viewed as a first step towards achieving atmospheric stabilization of GHGs. In this sense, the first-period Kyoto commitments may affect what future atmospheric stabilization level can be achieved. Relation to temperature targets. At the 16th Conference of the Parties held in 2010, parties to the UNFCCC agreed that future global warming should be limited below 2 degrees Celsius relative to the pre-industrial temperature level. One of the stabilization levels discussed in relation to this temperature target is to hold atmospheric concentrations of GHGs at 450 parts per million CO2 eq. Stabilization at 450 ppm could be associated with a 26 to 78% risk of exceeding the 2 degrees Celsius target. Scenarios assessed by Gupta et al. Suggest that Annex I emissions would need to be 25% to 40% below 1990 levels by 2020, and 80% to 95% below 1990 levels by 2050. The only Annex I parties to have made voluntary pledges in line with this are Japan and Norway. Gupta et al. Also looked at what 450 ppm scenarios projected for non-Annex I parties. Projections indicated that by 2020, non-Annex I emissions in several regions would need to be substantially reduced below business as usual. Business as usual are projected non-Annex I emissions in the absence of any new policies to control emissions. Projections indicated that by 2050, emissions in all non-Annex I regions would need to be substantially reduced below business as usual.